We have two presentations one from Josh and one from Sandra. Oh, there you are. So those should be good and on topic, on the disturbance topic. So today we're fortunate to have Skip Van Bloem here, and he is the new director of the Institute for Coastal Ecology and Forest Science at the Baruch Institute for that at Clemson University, which is so it's a coastal site in Georgetown, South Carolina, and a lot of parallels with our system here in terms of lower Everglades and same sorts of disturbance regime. But today he's going to talk about research that he had done until that time in the southwestern part of Puerto Rico, which is the dry part of the island, on hurricane effects of responses of forest.
Thanks, Mike. So it's great to be here, and it's particularly great to be able to come down from South Carolina, where it's easier to get to places than it is from Puerto Rico, and so I appreciate that already. When folks say that I'm from Clemson, and you guys maybe know if you know the geography of South Carolina, Clemson's way up in the northwestern corner of the state, and our institute's way down here. It's almost as far as you can get away from campus, which is good if you want to hide. It's not so good when somebody says, "Hey, do you know this guy? He's at Clemson." And the answer at this point is no. I don't know any of those people. But at any rate, this is the institute's it's on 17,000 acres of forest and coastal marsh. And so if you have a chance to come up, you should check it out. It's a pretty fantastic research institute. Today I'm going to talk about hurricanes, fires, humans, and the tapestry of Puerto Rican dry forests as part of the seminar series that I guess that Mike has put together for this semester. And the title of the seminar series, at least as I understood, is Ecosystems, People, and Disturbances in Coastal Hurricane-Prone Landscapes. That certainly fits for Florida, and it absolutely fits for Puerto Rico. It fits for South Carolina and the coastal area too, and it's something I spent all of my research career really looking at. And so let me explain how I got into hurricane research. I was going to be more of a traditional biogeochemist, and I was interested in how nutrients were cycled in tropical dry forests, and a lot of questions that actually Ramon Ortiz Salazar is working on now, some similar questions to that. We were looking at these sort of leaf indices of nutrient limitation, and I had set up this experimental fertilization project to occur in Puerto Rico in the summer of 1998. But it turns out that you have to have explosives permits to use certain fertilizers, and I couldn't get all that worked out through the Puerto Rican bureaucracy, and I had to go back in September. Well, around September 15th, I called my contacts in Puerto Rico and said, "I'm coming down this weekend to start this experiment, and I want to know if the lab's going to be open so I can pick up some of the supplies that I left there." And the lab director says to me, "There's this hurricane that's supposed to come to Puerto Rico sometime, maybe around next weekend or shortly thereafter." And I said, "Well, what's the chance that hurricane's going to hit Puerto Rico?" And she said, "It's about 30%. And I said, "Well, you're never going to get anything done if you're worried about a 30% chance of something." In my naivete. This is September 15th, 1998. That I think was unnamed at that point. And this is September 21st, about 3 days after I got to Puerto Rico, and this is Hurricane George. So that's why I study hurricanes, because I naive, stubborn, I don't know, whatever, silly enough to fly into an area that was about to be hit by a hurricane to try to do a fertilization experiment, which I never did because the hurricane kind of interfered. But instead, I got a much better project to work on because not every day that your field sites get hit by a hurricane. I mean, that's fantastic, right? So, you know, I got there and then, like, the first day I'm like, oh no, we're going to get hit by a hurricane. And then the next day I'm like, hey, we're going to get hit by a hurricane. And I happened to be staying in a house that was built by a guy that built nuclear power plants and stuff, so I wasn't all that worried about the house falling down. And so once I was kind of, you know, content with my sort of personal safety, then I was like psyched that this hurricane was coming.
We know all about that here.
Yeah. So my objectives today are to discuss natural and anthropogenic disturbance patterns in Puerto Rico, to highlight some positive and negative effects of non-native species in forest recovery, and to explore some potential for forest restoration. And so I'm actually not going to talk too much about this, but when we talk about the tapestry of Puerto Rican dry forests, or Puerto Rican forests in general, this is a series of hyperspectral data that you know, some of my collaborators have worked on, and you can see just across the top there's a bunch of different signals that you get when you look down, and that's the tapestry that I think about. Why do we see the different patterns where we do? What causes those? How are those forests different? And then how do they respond to disturbance? So I assume most people in Florida know where Puerto Rico is because there's a much closer cultural connection between South Florida and Puerto Rico than there is, say, between southern Michigan, where I grew up, in Puerto Rico, where people still ask if we use American money there, and how nice it is that we get to go to Costa Rica for the summer and stuff. But as you know, this is Puerto Rico, and it's a beacon in the middle of the ocean, and you can tell by all the lights on the island there. And Guanica is down here on the southwestern corner, near the southwestern corner of the island, and it's divided into two sections by Guanica Bay and in the town of Guanica. And it is still a forest because the King of Spain declared that his land when Puerto Rico was part of Spain, and that those were crown lands, and so they were never completely cleared for agriculture or for firewood as much of the rest of the island was. So because the King of Spain wanted to reserve some forest land for himself back in the 1800s, we have still forest reserves today that are related to that. It's about 4,500 hectares. It goes from sea level to 228 meters, which is unlike South Florida, right? And then and its annual rainfall varies. In the last 60 years, it's been as low as 363 millimeters and as high as 1,500 millimeters. So there's quite a bit of variation in rainfall. I actually want to talk about rainfall just for a few minutes before we talk about disturbance, because this is really a water-driven system, and the disturbance goes on top of that. But the growth of the forest, in terms of tree diameter, really closely tracks rainfall. It tracks it seasonally. This is the annual sort of average monthly rainfall, and you can see there's a dry season in the wintertime. There's this sort of spring wet season. It dries out again in the summer with the blue line here, and then you see again that there's a wet season that corresponds with the hurricane season. And if you look at the annual growth rates of trees of various sizes, and so the bars are different colors based on how large the diameter of the tree is, those growth rates we actually see shrinking. The trees actually get smaller in the dry season as they dry out. I know it's hard to believe, but it's really true. And so we see this. Now, the thing about these two seasons here, the spring dry, rainy season doesn't always happen. And the summer dry season isn't always dry. And so it's there's a lot of variation from year to year about what's going on there. Growth also tracks rainfall across years, and this is a sort of an incomplete but a snapshot of different data. The pink lines here, that's rainfall, and the blue lines are growth periods. And where the blue line is flat, that's what I call the funding gap. And this is before my time, but you know, I inherited this data from the folks that set these plots up, which Peter Murphy and Ariel Lugo, and so they measured growth from here, and then they started up again here, and then we've had some other periodic growth times. If you looked at this just from about the last 20 years, you'd say, look, rainfall's increasing, and so is growth increasing. This forest is grading, but that sort of ignores this period before, and so I think what we're finding, though, is just a very dynamic system, and the tree growth reflects the rainfall patterns, as you'd expect from a water-driven system, and that the beauty of having long-term data, you know, now nearly over 30 years, is that you can begin to see these patterns over time, and you're not likely to make some false conclusions over a short time period. Let's put some of these growth rates in context. I should go back one. Note the increment here. This is in centimeters. It's in tenths of a centimeter, so it's really millimeters. So this is no growth. What we see actually is that most of the time our annual growth rates are below 0.2 of a centimeter, or 2 millimeters. And that varies from year to year, but we're getting very, very slow growth in the forest. So if we put this in context with other dry forests or seasonal forests in the tropics, you know, the other dry forests, they're all pretty low down here. As you get into maybe 1,200 millimeters of rainfall, you start to pick up some growth, but pretty much dry forests grow slowly anywhere. But if you look at basal area, it begins to pick up for some forests as you get into wetter areas. Guanica, turns out, that is right here in both cases. So it's among the slowest growing of the dry forests that we have good data for worldwide. Now, what I'd like to do is to also build sort of a conceptual model of the states that we have in Guanica in the Puerto Rican dry forests, and they're similar to some states that we see in Hawaii as well. And so we build this sort of conceptual model of how disturbance and forest cover interact. First, let's just talk about the native dry forest and natural disturbance. The native dry forest has been there for, you know, eons, and it maintains itself within this regime of you know, periodic hurricanes. So what do these hurricane impacts look like? Well, this is a trail through the forest in August of 1998. This is that same trail on September 23rd of 1998, 2 days after Hurricane George came through. And let me just point out a few things to look at here. It looks like there's a lot of damage to the forest. But if you look real closely, you can see there's still a lot of trees that are mostly standing up. What's particularly noticeable up high is that most of those trees look like they've been defoliated, right? So defoliation was a major effect of the hurricane, but you can still see some of the trees have leaves if they were sort of at the subcanopy level. These forests aren't very tall. They're only about they average 5 to 6 meters in height, so that's, you know, 15 to 18 feet, so that's not very tall. Here's a tree that was blown over, so there is some wind throw. And the way I took the picture, it looks like it blocks that whole road. And you know, you would find maybe every 20 or 30 feet that a tree would have fallen across the road. you'll see some data on this that kind of is illustrated by these pictures. So one of the first things we did is I went back since I was there. So the nice thing, the lucky thing, and one of the things that made me excited about a hurricane coming is that I had over 2,000 tagged stems in the forest in 5 different plots, which is great because I knew exactly what condition they were all in on September 20th. You know, I mean, they had been tagged over the summer for these other projects, but so when the hurricane came through, I knew exactly what happened to every tree as a result of the hurricane. Well, we actually didn't have that much wind throw or stem loss. That means trees that were uprooted, or trees that were broken, or trees that were, you know, most of the branches were broken off of the tree. And so, you know, maybe, you know, across the different diameter classes in the forest, we had between 10 and 15%. The average was actually 12.7%. What we did notice is that the big trees, those larger than 7.5 centimeters, those were more likely to be blown over by about 50% than those that were smaller than that. Now remember, the big trees are this big, right? 3 inches. So that's not really. Now I'm in South Carolina and everybody's like, that's not a tree, you know, that's a shrub. And it's like, no, that's a tree. That's a tree in Puerto Rico. So in the dry forest of Puerto Rico, it's a shrub, I guess, in the rainforest. If we look at, that's a little messed up at the top. If we look at basal area, you can see the numbers across the top. In 1981, when we started doing structural measurements in the forest, our basal area was about 18 square meters of stem area per hectare. And then in 1998, right before the hurricane, that summer before, it was 22.4. And then in 1999, it was 19.1, so pretty close to back to where it was before. And then in 2009, because of delayed mortality, and this is what's kind of corrupted up there, it's 17.3. The stem density increased a little bit to right before the hurricane, and then came back to almost right where it was in 1981. In 1999, by the year after the hurricane, we see that mortality had basically balanced out with ingrowth. And so ingrowth over these 17 years was about equal to mortality. And then since 2009, we've had very low ingrowth, but we've had continuing mortality, which is why you see the decline in basal area and in stem density. So what was the general effect of the hurricane? Well, the general effect of the hurricane was to eliminate all of the growth in the forest from the previous 17 years, right? So pretty much took everything that all the growth from 81 to 98 and returned it to the 81 levels as a result of the hurricane, and then it's decreased a little bit since then with delayed mortality. So this system is, you know, I think of it then as this dynamic equilibrium, and so from your ecology classes, you know that the mature systems aren't actually stable, but they fluctuate around some equilibrium, and I think that's where we're at here in our forests. All right. So we have these patterns of ingrowth and mortality. Mortality increased dramatically immediately after the hurricane. In the wind-affected larger trees, I showed you that data. We've had delayed mortality for as long as 10 years later, which is longer than you see delayed mortality in wet forests. The effects of the hurricane canceled out the last 20 years of development, the previous 20 years of development. And the other interesting thing is that ingrowth, a lot of times you think, okay, the trees that are going to come in are going to be pioneer species. Well, in our case, we didn't see a pioneer species flush. There was no recruitment of pioneer species. It was the same old mix of species that was there previously. And the reason is because much of the ingrowth was from vegetative sprouting, either from root sprouts or suckers off of stumps or something like that. And so, so a lot of that growth is actually clonal growth from suckers off of the original roots and trunks. And here's where I'm going to show you some of this. Before the hurricane, about 4% of the trees had these sprouts that were coming off of them at the base. And when I'm in Michigan, since that's where I grew up, I can say, oh, you know, box elder trees, you know how you cut them off in your backyard and they grow back and you really can't kill them? And everybody relates to that. But we don't have box elder trees in South Florida, do we? So, so what's our weed tree here? That if it grows in your backyard and you cut it off, then it comes back.
Brazilian pepper.
Brazilian pepper, yeah. Yeah, all right. So Brazilian pepper? Yeah, okay. Whatever, you guys know, right? You guys know if it grows along the fence and you cut it down and it comes back, that's kind of what we're talking about here. So those types of sprouts. And on average, on those 4% of the trees that did have sprouts, we got about 2 sprouts per stem. But after the hurricane, now, the trees that were uprooted or the trees that were snapped, people might expect those to regrow because that's called coppicing, and that's really common. That's a real common response to wind throw in trees. But those trees that I showed you that were still vertical, still standing up, but defoliated, we wouldn't necessarily expect all of those to have basal sprouts. Sprouts that come up, you know, either from the ground or the base of the stem. But 32% of those had sprouts. And when they did, they had an average of 10 sprouts per stem. And those trees that were in the subcanopy that still have all the leaves on them, and when I went back and looked, and you know, 2 days after the hurricane, I couldn't tell if they had been defoliated or not. I assumed some, but not very much. 29%, so almost the same percentage of those stems sprouted. A few less, but still 6 sprouts per stem, as opposed to the 2 before. So you don't even have to break the tree or uproot the tree to generate this sprouting response. And that for us was an interesting finding because we had a very hard time explaining these patterns of stem density that we see in Caribbean islands. And so when you look at the first 3 locations are all Caribbean islands, and you see how their stem density is much higher. It ranges between 8,000 and 12,000 stems per hectare. And then you look at some of the continental locations, and the stem density is much lower. And to the best that we could, we just took this data from places where there were mature dry forests. So why do we have all this higher stem density? Well, we thought, well, maybe these forests were cut over before, but a student previous to me had done some work, and he couldn't find any real good evidence of that. No cut stumps, you know, no sprouts in a ring around where the edge of an old stump might be. We just didn't see the evidence that you'd see for a cut-over forest. Well, 42% of our stems are multiple, of our trees are multiple stem. That's why we have such high stem density, because we get trees that grow like that. That particular one has 28 stems, and so that's really quite high. That's a sort of the outlier. But a lot of them have 4 stems, 3 stems, something like that. So now we had an idea that maybe the hurricanes could generate this growth form, this multiple stem growth form. But the question was how? What triggers that sprouting response if the trees aren't broken? We can figure it out if they're broken. So in this picture, everybody, you know, the bananas here are it's really easy to see those. I don't really want you to look at the bananas. I want you to look at this tree here. And you see how this tree is not vertical? You know, most trees grow straight. And then the wind, in this case, blows it over. So normally, we would have some amount of, you know, we have the trade winds in the Caribbean, and they make the trees blow back and forth and sway back and forth, but from a vertical position. And then you get hurricanes that come through, and they have sustained winds that blow the trees over a little bit, And then the gusts make them blow back and forth even more, which is what I'm trying to show with this arrow here. So the trees bend over, and then the gusts blow them over that much more. That creates a whole bunch of strain right here at the base of the tree, because that's where the tree's anchored. The wind pushes up against the tree up at the top, but the strain is felt at the base, because that's the anchoring point of the tree. Well, what happens is when you have strain like that, trees, plants in general, but in our case trees, produce ethylene. That's a stress response that's related to strain and wounds and other things. But when ethylene, as a plant hormone, is produced, then it blocks auxin, and the downward flow of auxin. And if you remember your introductory plant biology class or your plant physiology class, wherever that's taught these days, auxin is the hormone that maintains apical dominance. That's the one that makes plants grow up tall and straight. When you block auxin, when you cut off the top of your plant, it makes it bluish out, right? And so even without cutting the tree off or breaking the tree off, by producing ethylene, which blocks the flow of auxin, you could theoretically produce, extra sprouts or allow the development of the lateral buds at the base of the tree. So that's what we think happened from the hurricane. So, it's not good enough just to think about it. You got to design some experiment, right, and try to figure it out. So it's really hard to pull a bunch of trees over in the forest. So we started in the greenhouse with one of my grad students and one of my undergrads while I was at the University of Puerto Rico. And so we picked a bunch of different species, and we applied some bending treatments to the trees. In some cases, we tied them down for about 24 hours. In some cases, we pulled them back and forth from a vertical position. You can see behind Jordan's head there that we attach these chambers to the back, and on those chambers right here, there's a little vial. And that vial has a solution in it that traps ethylene, which we can then take back to the lab and measure the ethylene production. And so we ran this experiment in the greenhouse, and we found, that yes, you can produce ethylene by bending the tree over. That if you flex the tree as you bend it over, you produce more ethylene. And then that was good enough for us to try to say, all right, well, let's try this out in the field. It's a lot more complicated in the field because the trees aren't all the same size, and they're not the same age, and they're not in nice little pots, and all that kind of thing. So the first thing we had to do is we attached strain gauges to the tree, and we let the wind blow on the tree for a while so that we could try to model how much force normal winds would apply to the tree, and then scale that up to hurricane force winds. Then, once we had that figured out, this is very high-tech science. It's called PVC, sliced in half, sealed with some kind of special grease, and held together with hose clamps. And this is this closed cell foam here that you buy at Walmart or the craft store to seal up the top and bottom. But it works pretty good. The same sort of idea with the vial, which isn't on here yet. And so we attach these big chambers to the base of the tree, and then we on the sort of the smaller size, the 3-inch trees, we pull them over with a winch, and we measure the force using a spring scale, as if you would measure the weight of the fish that you catch, when you're out deep sea fishing, and that works pretty well. And luckily, I had grad students and undergrads to help, because we couldn't just pull it over and leave it sit. We had to pretend it was a hurricane, and so we had to pull them and release them, and pull them and release them, back to a certain leaning level that would be like the sustained winds, right? And so pull, release, pull, release, pull, release, and a hurricane would probably do something like that. I don't know how many gusts an hour in a hurricane, but I can tell you that students and their professor cannot make as many gusts in an hour on a tree as the hurricane can. But so we did about 24 for our maximum sort of gust pattern. We we did some defoliation treatments. I'll show you that here next. Here's the results. Control in blue, defoliation. Remember, we had about 50% defoliation from the forest, so we cut off about 50% of the small twigs up in the crown of each of our experimental trees with that treatment. Static displacement, where we just pulled it over and let it sit. Hurricane George, the hurricane winds affected guanica for about 4 hours, so we did all of our treatments for 4 hours. Defoliation plus the displacement, that's in the white bar. You can see that in all of our species, in whichever location, we didn't see any significant effect of those first 3 treatments compared to control. Dynamic displacement, that's where we pull it to some place away from vertical, and then we apply, the certain number of gusts per hour, and that's where we found the increased ethylene production. That's what a hurricane does. I mean, to a much greater extent than what we're able to do, but that's what a hurricane does. And so the dynamic displacement creates this ethylene boost, with the exception of this species, exhaustive. Does that grow down here? Any keys? Wait.
Yes.
Yeah. So we weren't able to generate a higher ethylene response in exhaustive. It actually did sprout, but the sprouts didn't live very long. So I'm not quite sure what the story is there, but we did see the significant response in the treatments where we did dynamic displacement with the other 3 species. So let me just give you a quick summary of this. The mechanism of sprout response. You get a hurricane. The hurricane, instead of having the trees blow back and forth from the trade winds from a vertical position, it moves the tree, blows the tree over a little bit, and applies gusts from there, which applies extra strain to the base, changes the hormone concentrations at the base, and then that allows for sprouts to develop. And that, eventually, as the sprouts grow and survive and go up into the canopy, leads to these multiple stem trees. So that's our forest state, our native dry forest state.
Could you have induced sprouting by adding it?
By what?
Could you have induced sprouting by adding it?
Yes, we actually did that too. And I almost never talk about that because, honestly, I don't usually have tree physiologists in the audience too much, and more generally, ecologists don't think about that too much. But yeah, so we did an ethylene paste application to the base of the trees, and we were able to get some sprouts from that too. So we also did a blocker on some of our treatments. We also applied an ethylene blocker inside the chamber, and that was a little less interesting because then it just showed we didn't have ethylene. Yeah. So, but I want to switch from that. So our native forest. Let me go back. Our native dry forest, with a natural disturbance, the hurricanes, that sustains itself, and it has for as long as there's been dry forest in Puerto Rico. But starting around 1493, and even before, we had some anthropogenic effects in Puerto Rico. This is what the landscape looks like in relatively undisturbed areas. This is what the landscape looked like in most of Puerto Rico in the 1930s. And by when Puerto Rico reached its peak defoliation, there was only 4% of forest cover left. Now, let's put that in context for a minute. You hear about all these stories about Haiti and how terribly deforested Haiti is. Well, that's what Haiti looks like now, and that's what Puerto Rico looked like back in the 30s. So we cleared all the land in Puerto Rico, either for sugarcane production or tobacco, for coffee up in the mountains, but we cleared the forests off so we could grow the coffee in the sun. Those are the main crops. Also some fruit and some other stuff. But this is what Puerto Rico looked like in the 30s. Now the regeneration since that time, we haven't had large-scale agriculture in Puerto Rico since about the 1950s, when the labor markets changed. And so we've got this sort of regeneration that's this patchwork where we have forest in the hilly areas, we have grassland in the flatter areas that were either previously, in most cases, were either previously agriculture or pasture. And what's interesting about the grasses of Puerto Rico is there are almost no native grass species in Puerto Rico. There's something like, I think it's between 250 and 300 grass species there, but like 2% of those are native, and all the rest of them have been brought in, most of them from Africa, to be pastured. And a lot of them you can tell exactly where they were brought in first or who brought them in, because, you know, farmers are kind of natural experimentalists sometimes, and they go someplace else and they say, this grass looks like it might be pretty good for my cows, and they bring it back and plant it in their pasture. And so a lot of times we can pinpoint exactly where the grass came from. But in the dry zone, most of the grass is guinea grass, which was brought in the later 1800s by the Spanish for pasture, or hurricane grass, buffalo grass, which was brought in the 1980s. And that you see buffalo grass here. So the thing about grass is grass burns. And grass burns great. And it's fantastic fuel for fire. But the trees that we have don't burn very well. And the native grasses don't grow either thick enough or consistent enough across the landscape to really provide good fuel for fires. And we don't have any natural ignition source for fires because we don't have dry lightning. And I think that makes us a little bit different from Florida, because in Puerto Rico we only get lightning with storms. And if the lightning hits, it may burn a very, very small patch. But the largest one that we've been able to document from a sort of a natural source is about 10 square meters. That's a very small patch. So basically we don't have a natural fire regime. We don't have a very good fuel source to provide widespread fires either. But these invasive or these non-native grasses are a fantastic fuel source for fires. And you know, when you have dry grass and you have people in the same area, you're going to have fires because somebody's either going to be careless or some sort of pyromaniac or something, and they're going to want to watch the grass burn. And so we have fires all the time. In lots of areas along the roads, the grass burns every year, sometimes twice a year. And it's hard to figure out anything about forest recovery in those areas because they're continually burned. But we do have a few sites where they were only burned once. And they were forest covered before with a little bit of grass in the understory, and then they burned. And this is the site of one of them. It's in the middle of Guanica Forest. It's a place where a young couple decided that they weren't going to be a couple anymore, and they went into the forest and they burned all their love letters to each other. And the fire got out of control and got into the grass that was in the understory that had been introduced into the system. It killed all the trees, and that fire was in 1982. And this is just the summer of 2012. And what you can see is mostly grass. And in the background, you can see some cacti with some vines on it, and then some trees that were sort of outside of the area where it burned. So, what about forest regeneration after a single fire? Not places that burn a lot, but a single fire. These are 3 different single fires. Las Latas, which is the love letter burning site, Cuevas in 1998, and Ensenada in 2010. The trees that, if trees grow back, it seems that they grow back to the original height or the normal sort of forest, almost about the same height as the normal forest fairly quickly. So the y-axis is the percent relative to mature forest. But in most cases, we don't regain basal area, we don't regain stem density, even after nearly 30 years. So that I misspoke. That Las Latas was 1983, and so that site is this one here, And we're still only at 20% of the basal area that we would have from mature forest. The Ensenada site's got pretty good stem density relative to the others, but I can tell you that that stem density is decreasing because a lot of the stems that are left are dying still. So, and I'll show you about that in a minute. So, the fires also change some of the soil characteristics, and they under the grass. So you have a fire, and then the grass comes in, and then the pH, aluminum, and iron all increase. The things that you would expect to burn off, like carbon, nitrogen, and sulfur, those all decrease. And so you have different soil characteristics, lower fertility soils underneath the grass areas than you would in the forest. So what do we get? We can convert a dry forest into a grassland. That's this pathway here, number 2. We can maintain a grassland by continuing to burn it. That's path number 4. We have not been able to just say, okay, we won't burn anymore, and we'll let the forest naturally succeed back. If that was the case, we would expect better succession, better recovery of those forests in those single burn sites. That's pathway number 3, but we don't see that actually happening. So what we have instead is one state, the dry forest state, that maintains itself. But if a fire comes in, then it can be converted to a grassland, which then maintains itself. So we have these 2 alternate states. And just by removing fire, we don't return the grassland state to the forest state. So we wanted to look at these fire effects a little bit more with some of my students. So when fires go across the landscape, we wanted to ask these questions. Can the trees survive the fire? And can trees recolonize grasslands? And what are the barriers to both survival and recolonization? So Brett Wolf was one of my master students, and he's now at Utah State working on his PhD, and he did this very ambitious project where he planted a whole bunch of, he planted 400 saplings out into these areas that we do controlled burns in, and then he attached these pyrometers which measure heat to each one of these saplings, and then on some of them he trimmed around the saplings so there wasn't any grass, and some he just left the grass there so they would burn, and then we had some control trees. And this is a fairly complicated figure, but I'll lead you through it. These are 2 of the different, he did this in 3 different sites in the forest along the road. The nice thing about that is even if we didn't do control burns, we knew it would burn anyway because somebody would light the grass on fire. So when the fires occurred, and they actually were for these 2 sites controlled burns, we were able to measure the temperature of the fire at each stem using the pyrometers, and that's the x-axis. The y-axis is the percent of the stems that experience the particular temperature which survived. And so the squares correspond to the dotted line, and that's site number 1, and the numbers in the squares are the sample sizes. So you can see that at about 25 degrees Celsius, which was really no fire, 3 of the trees experienced that temperature and they all survived. They're at the top. The relative survival was 100%. At about 75 Celsius, you know, 1 died and 1 lived, et cetera, et cetera. But what you can see is the numbers increase. The circles are the other site. That was a little bit hotter fire. But what you can see is that most of the trees experience a hotter fire because the numbers are bigger in the circles and squares as you go along the x-axis. And that once you get beyond about 275 Celsius, you don't see a majority of the trees surviving at all. In fact, a lot of times, most of the trees don't survive even above 200 Celsius. So these are fairly low intensity grass fires, but even these fairly low intensity grass fires kill off most of the trees. Sapling level, they were in the ground for a year so that they could get acclimated to the system. It's not. We don't think it was just related to transplanting shock because we had them out for a whole year. So. So very low intensity grass fires kill off the majority of the small trees. Why do we focus on small trees? Well, for one thing, because we can manipulate those, but for the main reason is because that's what the regeneration is going to be. You don't regenerate a forest with a tree that's 4 centimeters already. You got to start with something small, right? So. What happened with these that did survive after the fire? So the red is the burned grassland areas, and the star is where the fire was. It's when the fire occurred. And you can see this big die-off here, and this is percent survival over here on this axis. This is rainfall, so these are rainfall events, through the time from between 2007 and 2009 that we were running the project. There was this. It was a pretty good spring rainy season in here, and so there wasn't that much mortality after the fire in the burned grassland, and in the unburned grassland in the forest, which were controls. Those, we had a little bit of mortality, but not too much. Up until we hit the dry season here, the June and July dry season, and then you could see that the fire killed off a lot of the trees in the burned grassland, and then the dry season basically wiped out the rest of them. And the dry season also had an effect on those that were growing in the open grassland areas without fire, and also in those that grew in the forest that we planted as control trees in the forest too. But still, nearly between 50 and 65% of these trees lived. By the end of this experiment, we had, I think that number there is something like. I don't know, 6 or 7 trees. There were hardly any surviving trees left after the combination of the fire and then the subsequent dry season after that. And remember, this is a water-driven system, so we would expect drought to kill things, so that the drought effects go on top of the fire effects. Now, how does a tree survive in a fire situation otherwise, in fire-prone areas? Well, one way they survive is they have thick bark. And Bill Hoffman, right, in NC State, has done a bunch of work in the Cerrado systems in Brazil. That's a fire-prone area. And what he has found is that the bark thickness has to be 6.6 millimeters. A bark thickness of 6.6 millimeters is enough to insulate the base of the tree from a low intensity grass fire like we would have had in Monaco. So that's great, right? As long as the tree is larger than 6.6 millimeters, as long as the thickness of the bark on the tree is greater than 6.6 millimeters, the tree ought to survive, or at least the majority of those trees will survive. So, what Brett did, this we've submitted now, and it's in review, is that he went and looked at the bark thickness of another 400 trees in the forest of various sizes, and so each of these dots is a tree that he measured the thickness of, and he looked at 20 different species of trees, and what you can see is that just with ignoring these vertical lines for a minute, is that most of those trees that he sampled didn't have bark that was thick enough to survive the fire. Now, where it really becomes an issue is when you look at these percentages at the top. So when we do plot studies and we measure the size of the trees, 95% of the trees in the forest are less than 7.5 centimeters, less than 3 inches in diameter. And you see how many of these trees actually had thick enough bark to survive? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So, very, very few of these trees of this size, which is 95% of the forest, have bark that's thick enough to protect the tree against the fire. If you go between 7.5 and 15 centimeters, still That's almost the rest of the forest. Still, less than half of those trees have bark that's thick enough to survive the forest. Only do you get a majority of the trees with thick enough bark if you get larger than 15 centimeters. But that's only 0.15% of the trees in the forest. There just aren't that many big trees in the forest. So if we continue to have fire, what we'll find is that it'll kill the smaller stems and open up more canopy so that the grass grows better, so that you can have more fire, so you can kill more stems. You know, it becomes this downward spiral of conversion of forest into grass. The last thing we wanted to look at was, well, if we could even get regeneration into these open grasslands, and we have a couple of different sort of forest types. We've got the natural, the sort of the native species dominated forest. We've got forest that's dominated by an introduced species, Musena leucocephala, that was also brought in by the Spanish about 200 years before. And so that's the exotic tree, the native tree, and then we have open grassland, right? And so in these, so we put out 100 seed traps, and we collected seeds out of them for a whole year, and we collected 35,600 tree seeds out of those traps. And in traps that were underneath exotic trees, we basically got exotic tree seeds. That makes sense. That's what's, you know, what's in the overstory falls into the trap. In traps that were underneath native, but we see a little bit of native tree seeds come in. Not too much, but a little bit. In the native forest, we, you know, seed traps underneath the native species collect native tree seeds. Not too many of Musena, which is kind of nice to see. Seed traps in open grassland don't really collect much of anything. 640 out of those 35,000 some odd tree seeds were collected in those traps in the open. 180 of those were native species, were seeds from native species. All of those were wind dispersed seeds, except for one. We have one animal dispersed seed in the seed trap. Now that matters because we actually have very few wind dispersed trees in the native flora in Guadalupe forest. Most of the trees are bird dispersed. And so why don't we get birds fly around? Why don't we get seeds from those tree species in the traps? Well, the answer is pretty easy, because there's nothing for the birds to sit on. So they fly over, and then unless they're going while they're flying, they're the deposits aren't landing in the open. So that may be the explanation for the one animal dispersed seed that we did catch. So on top of that, once you do have a seed in the area, the natural germination rates are extremely low, and then the seedling recruitment would continue to be low because a lot of these open grasslands are fire prone. So we just don't think that there's a very good way for these exotic grasslands to recover into some sort of native forest. So that reinforces that red X. The question is, if we're interested in restoration, how do we do that? We've got our natural forest, which regenerates itself. We've got this human anthropogenic disturbances that are a combination of agriculture that sort of kick things off, and pasture land, and then the grasses that come in. How do we, if the goal is to return some of this landscape to native dry forest, how do we do it? Well, we know we can't go this way. We potentially could if we drew a whole bunch of native trees, planted them out in the field, went out, once a week and weeded around them all, watered them a lot, made sure that the area never burned. But who's got the time and money to do that, right? So, what are our options? There is one native grass that grows it's a wiregrass. It's called Uniola virgata, and it grows in these fairly thick clumps, and it grows pretty well in the limestone areas where we work. And where we see the native grass. We also see the trees growing in between the clumps of the native grass, which is nice because there's a little bit of open area with some mineral soil for the trees to get to, for the seeds to get to, or for the sprouts to come up through, where they don't have to compete with the grass. So maybe if we reestablish native grassland, we can reestablish native forest. And so a project which I just got funded is to look at competition between native grasses and exotic grasses. And I can't say too much more about this except for that this native grass does burn. It's still a grass, it does burn, but the difference is it doesn't carry the fire across the landscape very well because it grows in discrete clumps. And when it does burn, it doesn't come back because the rhizomes are all right at the soil surface. And so it's not really a fire-resistant species either. Or we can go the novel forest route. This Lucena that was introduced as a fodder species in the 1800s, it actually grows pretty well with the grass, and if it burns, it just resprouts afterward. So it does a pretty good job surviving. The question is, can we get native species to establish underneath the non-native Lucena? And so, so we looked at a bunch of forest fragments that were Lucena dominated, and that we had the ages of the forest fragments. And you can see in the canopy, this shows the top 10 species by importance value in the canopy level here. And of course, we selected sites that were going to be dominated by Lucena and Prosopis jubiflora as mesquite, and those were in fact dominated by these. But you can see some of the native species were coming back. At the juvenile stage, still dominated by Lucena, but more of the native species. You know, there's still the native species coming back, and the Prosopis is dropping out. This is torchwood. Jason's here, right? This is your species. So maybe we've got a whole bunch of these butterflies there. Jason and I were talking about that in the seminar earlier. And then in the seedling class, we still see lots of Lucena that are present, but we see you know, a pretty good collection of the native species coming back. And so we can see that in the understory of the forests that are dominated by the non-native tree species, Lucena, our native species are coming back in there. And so maybe we can just get the Lucena established and let nature take its course from there. Whoops. So we looked at, here's my Spanish language slide for you guys. We looked at the percent of exotic individuals in the juvenile level of the forest, and this is the time since abandonment. And so this is the age of the forest fragment. And so in these that are younger, we see a lot more of the non-native juvenile size trees. But as these forest fragments age, most, you know, the percentage of the juvenile or the small size, understory size trees are very low as non-natives. Lucena are hardly, you hardly see very many of those in the older stands that are dominated by Lucena in the canopy. And really, that's a shade tolerance thing. They're not shade tolerant, and so they shade themselves out. And then the rest of what you see in the understory is the native species. So we think that just by promoting the non-native species, we can continue to help to, in the long term, promote the native species. Now, this is a really busy graph, and it's I think this is Brett's curse to me is that he plotted it this way, and it didn't leave the data with me in a convenient way to replot it. But what I want to show you is this one here. This is growth of native and exotic trees in grass. And the native trees, these are a variety of native trees. Those are the light gray. And you can see that, you know, most of those don't show very much growth. They're pretty much parallel horizontal lines. The Leucaena grows great in the grass. Look at how nicely all this. That's the black line is the Leucaena. So if we get the Leucaena established in the grasslands, or if we plant the Leucaena in the grasslands, it doesn't require that much maintenance. It survives the fire, and it grows pretty fast. If it can grow fast enough to establish a canopy that shades out the grass, which reduces the fuel load, then maybe that will help to promote the return of the native species into the forest. So similarly in height, although it's not quite as clear, and that's because sometimes you get some fires that come through and knock the Leucaena back, but the basal diameter continues to expand. But you definitely see that the native species in the gray behind either decrease in size, or they, which is from dieback, where they pretty much stay the same size. Also, we found when we planted native saplings, when we purposefully planted native saplings underneath Leucaena trees, that they grew 48% taller when they were planted under Leucaena as a nursery. So we think that's a good way to go. So in summary, the native mature forest is maintained by hurricanes. Land use practices have introduced a new disturbance, which was fire. Fire and invasive grasses perpetuate an alternate system in the area, which is grassland. It's not unique to Puerto Rico. We see it in other areas too. It's very well documented out of Hawaii, which is where some of these concepts originated. And then I think we can use these introduced tree species that have been in the system for hundreds of years. I'm not talking about bringing new ones in, just using the toolbox that we've already got in place as a tool to regenerate the forest. And so finally, this is my last slide for my content. You can see the hurricane and the fire imprint right here. This is part of the southwestern coast, the view of the southwestern coast of Puerto Rico. And all of this area would have been affected by Hurricane George in 1998. This area right here is that fire, one of those single burn fires from 1992. And this picture was taken in 2009. So which one has the longer term effect? Well, it's pretty clear, I think, from the picture here. All right. Well, thanks to a bunch of people, lots of collaborators. I've had a number of students that have gone through the system. I've been pretty lucky in funding, and none of this would really be possible without some really great government partners that provide us access to Guanaco Forest and the Fish and Wildlife Refuge at Laguna Cartagena and Cabo Rojo. So be nice to your federal partners even when they close. That's the professors already know that, but that's my message to students. They can be a little bit, annoying sometimes with their opening and closing dates, but other than that, it's worth it to be nice to our friends in the state and federal government and municipal governments. All right, are there any questions? Yeah.
Go back to the last trying to grow the plants in the grass. How does that
This one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I look at that. It looks like the natives also in the forest. They're not shrinking, but the plants just
Right.
start growing.
Yeah. So that's exactly right. So the native trees, remember I mentioned they only grow a few tenths of a centimeter or maybe a millimeter or less a year. They grow very, very slowly, and so that's why you don't see much of an increase here in basal area or even in height, because a lot of these trees they grow extremely slowly for native species. And that's also shown in other things. The wood density is really high on a lot of these species. That indicates a slow-growing species too. And so you see a few here that actually decrease in growth And this was from the transplant experiment. And so some of these, even at, when you transplant them into the forest, they die back a little bit, and that's where you see some of that decrease in height growth from the native species underneath the forest. Yeah.
It's really interesting to me that the Lucina don't just have a bunch of Lucina growing under them, but they're acting like they're street.
Well, if there's one place where I argue with my colleagues in Fish and Wildlife the most, it's about Lucina. Because they're supposed to protect endangered species and native flora and fauna and all that stuff, and they just hate Lucina because it doesn't belong in Puerto Rico, and it was imported from Mexico, and the Spanish brought it, and I don't know, there's a whole bunch of reasons. But, what we've seen, either when you plant the trees underneath it or when you just look at the sort of the unmanaged Lucina stands, is the native stuff comes back quite well. And like a traditional pioneer species, it's not shade tolerant, and so it shades itself out. So the nice thing about that is it's cheap, right? The bad thing about it is it takes time because you got to wait for 50 years for the effects to come, and that's not necessarily in your 5-year plan. When you've got to respond to your boss in Atlanta. Our Fish and Wildlife was all organized out of Atlanta, so I mean, I understand, but I actually think Lucina is probably a pretty good tool.
So how do you get that kind of response rate to actually make them happy?
Well, what I do is, I take my government partners out to the field, I show them what's going on, and then I talk about how cost effective it is to not to bulldoze everything out, because the traditional forest restoration program is to take a bulldozer and wipe out all the Lucina, and then go back and plant something. But then everybody complains about all the weeding that you have to do and the irrigation and all the rest of that stuff. And so, so I talk about it in terms of cost effectiveness. It's more cost effective to plant underneath the Lucina and leave it alone. You don't need the bulldozer. You don't need the fuel for the bulldozer. You don't need as much fertilizer. You don't have to go back and weed it. So you can have your people use their time more wisely somewhere else. And in the long run, you get better survival. So, that's how I actually, with another student, I actually looked at the economics of different types of restoration practices, and the only thing that really mattered, it was cost effective, was mulching. So when you planted the trees out, whether you were in the open or whether you were in the understory, if you mulched around the base, then you would decrease some of the competition from grasses, and you could preserve some of your soil moisture, and that made a difference, but nothing else really mattered. Yeah.
Do you know how the Lucina responds to hurricanes? Like, would that possibly speed up that process?
Yeah. So it responds a lot like the native stuff does. It actually turns out to have a little bit higher rates of snapping, because Lucina is a pretty weak tree. But it grows back real fast. So those snap trees always resprout. Pretty much can't kill them, and until they just die of old age. And they're not really a long-lived species, and so 50 years or so, maybe 80 years or so, they'll be pretty much take themselves out of the system anyway. And so they respond a lot like the native species. So a little more damage, a little higher damage rates at the beginning from the wind, but very high sprout rates. So they recover very quickly. Yes?
Have you looked at insects that have the Lucina kind of going into the ground and then they have special? Have you looked at soil? Have they changed it actually so that it's more nutrient rich and then lower inputs, like aluminum and things that would probably causing a barrier to the native species?
Yes. Nitrogen increases, which we'd expect. Lucina is a nitrogen fixer. So it builds nitrogen and it builds carbon back into the soil fairly quickly. The aluminum and iron is actually not different than the grassland. It's lower, but the samples that we have, there wasn't enough variation, enough difference for any sort of statistical significance. And so it looks a little bit lower, but I think we're going to kind of wait and see on that. But it definitely rebuilds the carbon and the nitrogen pretty quickly. The problem, though, is that these forests are phosphorus limited. Phosphorus didn't really change that much. So, but the carbon, the carbon content in the soil is also related to the ability of the soil to hold moisture. So that's still important. So,
How many years?
For which?
Like, if you have a debate, like, next thing on the ground, how many years do you start to see that higher?
So actually, the data that I showed is from the grassland site is let me think about that. That was the 1983 burn, and the Lucena. I think the age of that stand was a little less than that. So I think that stand really sort of became established in the early 1990s. So that was about 20 years. But that stand actually occasionally it's on the edge of some other grassland area, and so it still has some grasses that are in the understory. So just having the trees there, even though the grass is still there, makes a big difference.
Do you have bracken? Do you have any issues with bracken burn? Yes, a fire responder.
No, not in the dry forest, but up in the mountains, in the wet forest, where it gets 3,000 millimeters of rainfall a year, it still gets dry enough sometimes in the dry season that you can get some fire through there once in a while, and there where you get fire through, then you get a firm response sometimes. So, but a lot of times you also those areas, once they get established, they kind of become these mixed grass and fern areas, and then they continue to burn later on too. So.
Thanks, Jeff.